Yeah, it's a pleasure to introduce our presenters today. For the first time, we have a duo presenting, so that should be exciting. We're very happy that Sasha Poquet and Bodong Chen join us today. Sasha is a researcher at the Center for Change and Complexity, the C3L, at the University of South Australia. And Bodong is Associate Professor in Education and Technology at the University of Minnesota. And together, they will talk to us today about what I think is the intersection of their research interests, namely using learning analytics to study complex situations of learning, and in particular, through the lens of networks. So we're very happy that they are both here today to join us. And I'd like to invite them to share the screen and get started.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Sasha Poquet, and I'm a researcher, as Anushka said, at the C3L at the University of South Australia. So it's early morning in not yet sunny Adelaide. And I'm looking forward to presenting with Bodong today. So I'll speak a bit later, and I just pass the mic to Bodong.
All right. Thanks for joining this webinar. Like Sasha, I'm very excited about this opportunity of engaging with everybody on this topic. And my name is Bodong Chen. I'm from University of Minnesota. Here I study collaborative learning and also learning analytics and also educational technology. So we have a brief agenda for for the webinar. We're going to start quickly by diving into a quick introduction to the network view. And then that will continue towards another section that will be led by Sasha about applied network analysis, where she will basically talk about 4 core messages. And I will continue after that to talk about how to apply network analytics in teaching by sharing some very practical examples and tricks that this community have been developing over the years. Hopefully we can save plenty of time for Q&A. So that's the plan. So first of all, as many of us are knowing, that networks are everywhere. Networks provide a powerful way for us to think about all kinds of phenomena on a very gigantic level. The galaxy are mapped as networks that are held together by gravity. At a smaller but still massive scale, countries are studied as networks as well. Networks of all sorts based on trade, migration, flights, and so on. At the personal level, which is probably the most familiar to us, is we map social networks to study social ties, positions, power, information flows in our society. And at a very microscopic level, we also study brain activities as networks of brain cells and neurons. So networks are fundamentally as part of our toolkit as we try to make sense of this world. Why it's that? Why networks and why networks are so broadly used to make sense of the world? And I think there are multiple reasons, and there are mainly 4 reasons I see, which could be more reasons you can tell us more about. So first of all, number 1 reason, as I see, is networks provide a very rich and unique representation of phenomena we study. Even though network data can be represented in many formats, could be a matrix, could be edge list. However, network visualization provide a very powerful way to communicate information that's easy to grasp visually, but it's not available in other kinds of representations. So for example, when we look at this interesting network of flavors, and when we see colors and their different sizes of nodes, different positions, different width of the links, and so on, there's so much information packed into this networks that can help us see the structure very intuitively. And that's one reason networks are used so popularly to communicate and to help us make sense of all kinds of phenomena. And the second reason, as I see, is besides those visualization, network analysis also provides a rich set of network indices and measures. For example, if you're interested in understanding how connected a network is, congratulations, you have a host of measures like density, diameters, average width degree, and so on to help you to characterize how dense and how cohesive this network is. And if you want to study individual actors and ask the question of who are the most dominant actor in this network, again, you have a bunch of centrality measures to help you to get to answer those questions. And here is just a few of measures that are quite basic. And there are many even more sophisticated network modeling techniques that can help you test hypotheses, model dynamics, build theories. So analytical richness is also quite phenomenal when we think about networks. And the third reason I think it's very popular is it's also very actionable. And we can derive actionable insights based on network representation, based on finding from network analysis. For example, there's one study from our community. Colleagues have been developing intervention based on social network analysis. What you see on the top are 3 sociograms or social network visualization from 3 classes. And the team that designed a holistic intervention based on social network analysis. And one important component of their intervention was to boost awareness of students by showing anonymized social networks to students and ask them to reflect and suggest how they could improve. So this is one simple way of acting upon such information. And as a result, their 3 classes kind of improved in terms of their connectedness, in terms of how students moving from the less connected roles towards occupying more central roles, and there are more collaboration happening in those classes. So networks can kind of help us act upon this information. That's one key message from this slide. And finally, but at least not least important, is I think it's also important to recognize the epistemological position in network analysis. There's an argument made by many network analysts that is relational structures are real, exist independent of social actors. And one way to think about it is if we go to the forest, we only see the trees, but the paradigm shift happening in the forest ecology is the trees are actually secretly talking to each other through underground network of fungi. And the same applies to the study of more abstract forms of relations, such as in the actor network theories. We're talking about the world as a constantly shifting network of relations that involves both human and non-human actors. So in those different theoretical frameworks, we're saying that epistemologically, we have to give priority to relations, not only to the actors or entity in those networks. So those are all kinds of reasons, I think, why networks are so popular, why people are using that to make sense of the world. But in education, when we think about education, they also, those different aspects also apply, in my opinion. For example, when we think about the current pivot to distance learning that's happening in response to the COVID-19 crisis, one way to think about it is there's a response is orchestrated by the leaders, by the administrators in our educational system. It is also true, based on my lived experience as a parent, that is, there are all kinds of players, entity, as you see on this graph, is both parents, teachers, peers, families, communities. They're acting and reacting to each other's action, and they're shaping each other's practices when we're navigating this difficult time. And the same thing applies to our everyday education activity. So at a societal level, I think education functions as a complex heterogeneous network. And that's why it's more important for us to think about educational phenomenon as networks. And at a more micro level, when we think about individual classes, when we think about individual, MOOCs, it's also important to recognize there's a socio-technical system at play that's shaping our educational processes. As learners do things in their course, they're reacting to their pedagogical system that are put in place by the teacher and instruction designers. And as learners do things in the socially shared space, they also self-organize into social systems. So both pedagogically driven individual and social activities are constrained, enabled by technological affordances. So those socio-technical systems frame how one can see micro-level processes of teaching and learning in those networks. So, so the question after going through this quick introduction is how network analysis can be helpful. If network is so important for education or so used for education, how analysis can be helpful for our understanding of learning and teaching. And from this point, I'm going to pass that to Sasha to engage us with this topic.
Thank you, Baudon. So yeah, as we ask ourselves how network analysis can be helpful for understanding learning, we really need to look back a little bit as to the work that has been done before. So if we look at the next slide, we'll see this screenshot from 2011. So that's from the very first Learning Analytics conference that talked about the use of networks or tools that use networks of students to bring insights about what's happening in the classroom. And in reality, a lot of the work that comes these days in learning analytics is coming from a lot of social science research and learning science research, among others. However, instead of telling you, we decided to focus on 4 things when talking about analysis. And that really boils it down to core messages that we thought were important come through when you use networks to analyze learning, especially using digital learner traces. So the first core message is networks are much more than social networks. The second message is not all centrality measures are made equal. The third message is network models matter. And the fourth message is network evaluation is subjective and multidimensional. And I want to say a few words about this last one, because really that's the core activity of what learning analytics wants to often inquire about learning. So is that an effective network? Is this a network of learners or a course or activity? What does it tell me? Is it good? And all these other points prior, they kind of rest upon each other fundamentally to come to this last point. And so I'll pack it with an example when we get there. I'll ask put on next slide. Just one before. Yeah. So core message 1, networks are more than social networks. And what you see here on the slide is an example of a social network that shows us clusters of learners. In this network, nodes are both learners and topics. And these clusters are derived from combined activity of the two. This represents some way of analyzing networks, one way of analyzing networks in learning analytics, and I'd like to refer to it as using networks as a method. And in this sense, I'd like to talk about networks as graphs, because at this point, they are a collection of diverse entities and relations, and network analysis is used as a method to reduce high-dimensional data. We see another example of that on the next slide. So for instance, one can cluster learners through graph partitioning. In this graph, nodes are learners and resources in the LMS. So we're looking at a relational data set. Learners do not interact with one another. So it's not your conventional Facebook kind of situation where that's the first association for many people who start with just analyzing relations between the students based on their engagement with the resources, reducing high dimensionality. Another example is analysis of text. So here we have 2 groups of students with different activity exemplified through networks, where networks are analyzing the annotations the students put on the video. The next slide presents a similar example, which shows us 2 networks of students with different levels of activity. However, here the nodes in the graph are buttons, navigation buttons. So we see how one's activity can be more dense and less dense based on how engaged the learner is. And finally, as you can see on this slide, recently we have a surge of research within so-called epistemic network analysis. So here graphs are used to analyze relations between the idea units or constructs within the discourse. And this is really a very complex methodology, because it builds both on the graph theory understandings as well as methodologies of content analysis. And besides the different types of nodes and entities that can be placed within a graph, we also conventionally look at relations between people, and normally the ties between them are referred to as communication ties or interaction ties. However, in reality, the operationalization of these ties can happen through semantic overlap or artifact use or timing of when the learners are doing something, or could be course enrollment or composite of the above. And much of this work around communication and interactions between people traveled to learning analytics through researchers who are also heavily engaged with learning sciences and CSCL communities. So as we move to the analysis of people and relations between people, where nodes in the graph are people, and the representation of the graph has something to do with socially shared learning and communication, we slowly stop talking about graphs only, but we start talking about networks as a little bit more theoretically, conceptually heavy. So in this sense, graphs can also be used as a methodology to analyze socially shared learning and communication. And that moves me to my second core message on the next slide, which is not all centrality measures are equal. So as you may know, network centralities measure network positioning. It's an encapsulation of relational data to a single point that describes a learner or a node in a graph in this sense. But the shift from centrality to positioning is also a theoretical one, because positioning implies that where you are in the network means that you have certain benefits and certain constraints. For instance, if you're very popular, that's good for your reputation and influence, but it also constrains what you can do because of your positioning. And so that conceptual understanding also implies that people with similar positioning or similar centrality also have similar benefits, and that opens up for possibilities for assessment. In learning analytics, we have used that quite a bit. So looking at learner positioning in a network and in different kinds of networks in relation to the learning outcome. And as the next slide shows, these relationships are a mixed bag. They're not always consistent as to what we see. And so the question arises as to why the inconsistencies. This brings, I think, and this is the core of this second message that we put, is that not all centrality measures are made equal. And you'll see that if you go through different learning analytics papers. The short answer to that is that a centrality only represents the relations that were put into a network from which they were, the network that was constructed. So the next slide shows or what you call it, scaled down portrayal of the continuum of what different ways of representing networks can look like. For instance, on the left side, you see, or it's left side, not yet there, just let's stay here a little bit. So for the left side, you see the direct reply. If you look at direct reply networks, so who replied to whom is going to be one set of relations. That's your data set, right? But if you look at everybody who was in a discussion thread or everybody who talked about climate change on Twitter, that's also a sort of relation, and that's a shared thread relation or co-presence relation. That's your right side of continuum. And that set of relations between nodes in a graph is going to be very different. And so once the centrality is derived on the same nodes, the same centrality, because the network or the sets of relations are ultimately different, the relationship between node positioning or learner positioning in that network of communication and the outcome is going to be different. And so that has been shown in the study quoted on the slide by Alyssa Wise and colleagues, as well as Ed Fincham then extended it. And we know that both descriptive and statistical analysis will produce different results based on what the network was conceptualized. And as the next slide shows, the learning analytics world is a lot more complicated than just two choices of what you do when you look at learner interactions in a socially shared space. So the networks can be constructed in a variety of ways. And so then the evidence as to positioning in a network and relationship with the learning outcome can lead us to very different conclusions. On the next slide, I have a summary from the core messages for this core message that not all centrality measures are equal. And ultimately that implication is that the same centrality on the same network can reflect different behaviors. So what to do about it is that you can think of, you have to be mindful of validity issues. So whatever measure you're using, is this measure generalizable, and what does this metric mean? A range of work has been done to validate centrality measures, and I can talk about it in the Q&A if that's of relevance, but there's also a range of work that we're not even covering or getting close to with this presentation, such as work from psychometrics, on psychometrics network, cognitive science, multi-level networks, network science, epistemic network analysis. All of these offer approaches to validating centrality measures. So if that's of relevance to your work, we can tap into this during the Q&A. I'm gonna move to my favorite message probably, which is network models matter. And if you see, we're moving from looking at the graphs that have relations and nodes and entities, and learning analytics can be many different things, towards centralities that represent one's positioning. So there is an expectation as to one is doing something that where social activity will bring some benefit related to learning. We're moving towards a full-fledged methodology of using networks, if we wanted to do that, in order to interpret our measures properly. And so network stops being a graph, it really becomes a construct. And so the next slide summarizes this really nicely, and it's probably the best representation I've ever seen of this message. It done by colleagues for the very first issue of Network Science, and they show that the network model takes a phenomenon, abstracts it to a concept, and only then represents it in network data. And the important shift in the last two is the network concept. So what our ties, what our nodes and relations in a network that we're dealing with learning analytics, what these things mean, is not necessarily yet the data, but it is still a definition of the relations and actors. And only then we operationalize that through one or many data sources. And so, examples of that, there are many examples of using networks as models in a more complex manner, and I have a couple of examples. The next slide shows an absolutely outstanding paper by Dan Suthers, who constructs and analyzes informal learning using chat data, using a three-level approach where it builds from events and process logs to uptake through semantic relationships and up to social ties. So the ties ultimately are still interactions, but the meaning, the definition of that tie, and then its operationalization is a lot more nuanced. The second slide gives another example of a colleague from information science, Sean Goggins, who also views networks as models and contextualizes interactions through other activities. And each of these parameters defined in the model is then operationalized through data sources very, very carefully. The next slide has an example of the model that Bodon and I have applied, where we have developed what we thought would explain learning and through interaction and interaction as events, and then used these sort of theoretical pillars of what our network, how our network was forming through this in the statistical analysis. The example I'd like to focus on is the one that I'll be using in the case study that I'll be talking about. So this is the representation that conveys the model I currently use in my own analysis of learning activity in digital communication. And it ultimately looks at learner communication and learning management system as a three-level activity. At the first level, you see the posting network. So that's a network of posts where the entity in the graph is a post and the relationship between them is defined as a reply structure that is coherent with the system where the students are interacting. The second level of activity within this learning system is communication network that arises from the posting network. And so in the second level, I look at network of learners, not so much posts anymore, and the relationships are derived from the posting network. And then the third level of activity within this learning system for me is the social network. And so the social network is similar to communication network, but not identical, because it derives the ties that are more prominent based on certain rules that filter, if you like, the communication network. Ultimately, there are three different levels that are being used to represent the system of learning and its dynamics. And as I will show, evaluating a course was useful for me using these three different dimensions separately. And so this brings me to the last point I'm supposed to make here with the core messages, which is network evaluation is subjective and multidimensional. And I think, as I said before, this is, in learning analytics, that's something that we very often are faced with. And as long as I've been doing network analysis, I've been talking to stakeholders, instructors, and learning designers who've been asking, okay, well, what can you tell us about these interactions that learners have? Are they effective? Are they people learning? And I think over time, I've convinced myself, if you like, maybe there are people who will think differently in the audience, I've convinced myself that this is not a simple question. And I'd like to unpack it with this next slide, which is social learning as we know it is a multi-level phenomenon, multidimensional phenomenon. Separating these levels requires looking at them through different indicators. And there is no evidence, there is no reason for us to think that one indicator is consistent with another and has to be high or good, if you like, effective at all levels, which means that we have to make choices as to what levels matter to the instructor and what then consequentially what indicators matter to the instructor. So the evaluation of networks in learning analytics sits very much within what instructor wanted from the course, and there is no one effective network fit for purpose. And so the example I'd like to demonstrate this through is the analysis of 20 online forums that I've conducted at the University of South Australia. It's a part of the seed grant. So I just, there was a question that is, could you walk through a simple example from start network to graph to construct to help the understanding of network graph construct? I'll try to do that as I walk through the example. So this is analysis of forms. Basically, the task I had as a practitioner was, can you tell us more about the activity of learners between these courses so we can understand what the good practices are? As a researcher, I wanted to see the relationship between the network structures and the learning design. I used those two questions for myself to look at the 20 courses. So what you have here is the PCAs, or the principal component analysis of 20 courses. Each little dot and a letter represents a course. And first, I used that the theoretical model of that baseline activity in the forum is posting activity. So direct indicators of posting and clustered courses based on the posting networks indicators. And so the results that we see is that all the courses fall into 4 components. So some of them have high activity and high turn taken, some have moderate activity and high turn taken, some have high activity but low turn taken, and some courses have low activity and low turn taken. It's obvious that low activity and low turn taken courses were not designed for social learning. But how do you decide which one's better? Is high activity and high turn taken better than moderate activity and high turn taken? It's very difficult to evaluate that without knowing more. And so that's where the second level comes in. Now, for Jason, who asked me a question, how do you move between these 2 different levels here? So the posting network was then abstracted to learner network. And there was a paper that we presented at LAC 20 today, this year, that talks in great detail, 7 pages, as to how you can do that. So I'd like Bodon to move to the next slide, please. And so having understood the posting behavior within these 20 courses, we wanted to look at the communication structure. So now the evaluation of the activity happened at a very different network, because that's what we were evaluating. And in communication, I'm just going to use the first 2 quadrants, because remember I said in the first example, how do you know what's better? Somebody who has high activity and a lot of turn taken, or not so much activity, or moderate activity, but a lot of turn taken. When it comes to communication structures within these networks, we know that in the first quadrants, for instance, we see a lot of inequality as to who talks to whom, but there are vibrant communities. In the second quadrants, we have not so many communities, actually just 1 community. And the communications between people are not so equal. I see your questions, Yad, and I think that some of that will be addressed in the second part of the presentation. So the third slide here, the next one. Yeah, excellent. starts bringing back these indicators to the third level. So when you abstract from the communication patterns to social patterns, so we're looking at the third type of network, we're starting to look at the indicators of social relations. And so what we learn, for instance, in that quadrant on the right top, where I have forum D, we see what looks like a small world network, so a network of small groups that are interacting a lot, which is why you would have high turn taken and high activity and high inequality as well, because not everybody's talking to everybody. So that describes that archetype of a learning design and can tell us something about what the instructor planned and what we observed. So that's the relationship that you can start seeing between the different levels of indicators and the design. Bodong, let's go to the next one. Just skip this one, and yeah, excellent. And let's look at forum K as contrast to forum D. So what you see here is social relations in a course where learners were not asked to talk to one another. And I like this example because that's something that people often do. So can you please post your opinion about a reading in week 2 or reading in week 3? So that's the course where the posting activity indicators had low turn taken, but high activity because people were asked to post. Makes a lot of sense, right? So is that good or bad? Well, it depends what you wanted. We also see that the communication pattern there have high dyadic exchanges, which surprised me when I looked at that. I was like, well, why are these people exchanging? What are they, who's exchanging? They're not asked to exchange. And then when you look at the social structure of the social network, so the third level of analysis here, you can see that the relations between people resemble preferential attachment network. In other words, social relations do develop. They develop between people who select to talk to one another based on their interest at the time, which means that you don't have the amplification of information, but you do have social relations. Whether the development of these social relations are better than the ones on the forum D is an instructor choice. The question, are these the full sets of class memberships? Yes, these are 25 to 30 person classes. So we're talking about small networks and we're talking about the different patterns of activity. Maybe if that helps a little bit to address partially the question I have pending there in the chat, which is these visualizations are complex, how do we use them practically? I think Bodong will talk about that a lot, but my message is that it's not always easy to convey what's happening in social learning situation without getting into the fact that social learning is a complex phenomenon. So if we just want to look at the students' activity, then you can count how many posts they have posted, but that's going to be one aspect that what you're evaluating. So unpacking how one can understand what happens, for instance, how much they post, or whether they're posting the way you like them. How are they communicating? If you wanted a democratic class where everybody connects to everybody, but then you're using share your opinion on X, it's probably not very likely that you're going to have a sort of an amplified communication pattern. If you're building communities, then you're probably not going to choose the instructional design in forum M, because there the communities do not develop as just one amplified network with not very high dyadic exchanges. And so the core message here, and this is my last slide. So that's just a bit down. Yeah, this one is that if you look at the analysis of learning analytics kinds of data, to understand learning, you have to remember that a graph is a tool that will give you the insight and can give you a wide range of insight. So networks are much more than social networks. If you want to understand positioning of a node in that graph, you have to remember what your context is and what is the data and the meaning of the ties that you're capturing. Are they valid? Are they generalizable? Or is it just a data science exercise of one time off? If you're starting to model that statistically, you have to think, what is the model? Am I actually modeling the phenomenon that I'm interested in? And then if you are evaluating, and my answer to that has been consistent throughout the years, ask the instructor what the instructor wanted, build an indicator towards the instructor goal, and help instructor reflect. Because network evaluation is multidimensional, it is complex, it is subjective. But as you have already flagged that, how can network analysis be used to support teaching and learning? And I pass on the mic to Baudouin.
All right, thanks, Sasha. It's amazing how you're talking and also monitoring the Q&As. I cannot do that. So that's very sophisticated skills. So from this part, Sasha has unpacked the very complex part of analyzing networks. And from this part, I'm going to talk about primarily from mostly practitioner or practice side of, how we think about networks, how we think about applying network analytics in teaching and learning based on what we have talked about so far in this webinar. And here I have three messages. The first message is probably for many people to think about, no matter whether you're an instructor or you're from an instructional team who is supporting instructors. The first thing to me is to think about to what extent learning is a networked phenomenon in your context, because that matters a lot based on what Sasha has already talked about in this webinar. And there are a number of learning frameworks that are helpful for this thinking exercise. For example, networked learning is an umbrella term that have been around for decades. It argues that learning is about developing and maintaining connections with people and with information, so that communicating with each other in a way to support each other's learning is just as important as acquiring knowledge from the authority, for example. And also connectivist learning is kind of falls under this umbrella. It points out that learning is a process of connecting specialized nodes or information sources, as George Siemens articulates. What you see in this graph is the case of a connectivist MOOC, and the author is trying to think of the open network learning ecology in CMOOCs, where learners are positioned in an intersection of personalized and networked sub-situations, where they're encouraged to be, autonomous, to be self-directed in managing their connection and their activities and their, interaction with other people and with the resources. So here is one way to think about how we kind of use this learning framework for us to design a learning experience based on this framework where networks are important. Another example, which is where I'm kind of coming from, is a knowledge building community approach. And this approach argues that learning happens when a community gathers to collectively improve their ideas that they care about as a community. So learning here, they cannot be understood or examined without understanding peer interaction, without understanding knowledge building discourse. And it cannot also be not understood without thinking about not only human relation, but also ideas, how ideas evolve and how ideas are fitting into each other and how ideas are, combined to become a bigger ideas. So here is another way of thinking about, connected learning or networked learning is to think about humans and artifacts and ideas as a large and heterogeneous network as well. So taking such an approach would drive your pedagogical choices that will favor network view of learning, basically. And the second message from in this chunk of discussion is we want to recognize that the sociotechnical systems play very important roles in facilitating networked learning. And this is kind of obvious to many of us in this chat is because briefly speaking, social media is so broadly used these days to support learnings, to support social learning, personal learning, and the thousands of organized chats happening on Twitter, and there are very novel tools such as Flipgrade that are supporting social learning through asynchronous video communication and so on. What is important to realize is those different sites provide very unique affordances for networked learning, which might and might not be the type of learning you want to facilitate based on what you want to, what you favor in terms of your learning approaches. So this goes back to the first point I made is how to find a way, how to find a socio-technical system that are aligned with your pedagogical or theoretical thinking on learning. That's very important as well. Another example is knowledge form, which I've been working on for many years. It is designed to sustain work around ideas. It tries to involve many people to gather on this collective space where they can use multiple type of representation to advance their idea. So this is another one example that provides a rich arena for collection, for collaboration, for interaction. And Another one of my favorite tool I want to mention here is very interesting. It's called Hypothesis. It supports social reading online, and in a nutshell, it creates a layer of interactivity on any web document. So when you think about right now, a lot of people, they can not meet face-to-face in the classroom, but they want to talk with each other when they're discussing very dense articles. And that's where Hypothesis can be very useful. So when learners are reading an article online, they can, highlight, take notes, they can reply to each other's comments. Moreover, they can see comments left not only by their peers, but in some cases left by fact checkers who are professional scientists about a specific phenomenon. So this type of multi-layer interactivity involving multiple types of people and ideas can be very interesting. And that's why I think this type of infrastructure could be helpful if we want to really advance or facilitate social interaction in learning processes. And it's important to be mindful of those different affordances provided by different systems out there. So from here, I want to quickly mention one example from my own teaching. A course I'm teaching at the University of Minnesota is social network analysis. And here I've been teaching this for a few years, and to support social and collaborative learning, I try to weave together an interconnected system that involves multiple tools. For example, we use Zoom for every week we have a Zoom meeting. We use Slack for communication. We use Hypothesis for social reading. There's a specialized tool called Frog that I use to facilitate Zoom meetings and in-class collaboration activities. So here I want to quickly mention a few things that's happening. I intentionally designed in this course to facilitate more interaction. So here what you see is a page of the course reading where the learners, every week they read articles that I post and they annotate using Hypothesis, and they interact with each other before coming to the Zoom meetings. So here it created a rich opportunity for them to encounter with each other. So that's the social part, is student-student network are constructed as they read the article. In the same time, it's important for me when I think about they want to get something out of this reading, is they are also forging connection between themselves and the text. And they're also connecting text with different kinds of hashtags that they're trying to assign or index their knowledge as a community. So there are all kinds of connection that's happening here. And during every Zoom meeting, I use Frog. Frog is developed by my friend and colleague, Sten Haglef, that is trying to use graphs as orchestration graph to represent very sophisticated collaboration patterns. And during the Zoom meeting, I used Frog to organize students into different kinds of activities. And here, I don't want to unpack this, what they mean, but different objects you see are different kinds of operator or different kinds of activity. And the lines are basically sending people or sending artifacts or sending data to form a very, kind of workflow within the classroom. So by designing this technical system, we try to focus on linking objects across time and across space. Across time means like there are objects produced before the class and we want to revisit them during the Zoom meeting. So we want to focus on how to reuse them, how to make them live longer, not saying like they leave annotation and throw them away, but how to reuse them in the future interaction. That's where we want to focus on here. So this is a zoom in into one activity. What you see is annotation made by the class get imported through APIs into the Zoom meetings, where one class or one small group are in charge of making sense of those annotation and distill high-level ideas. And such design try to harness not only human connection in the moment in the small group, but also connections made by the learners with the text before the class, as I just mentioned. So those are, again, practical things that I think we can think of as we try to develop and design or help other people design socio-technical systems to support interaction and connections in learning. And the final message I want to mention is how there are a lot of network analytic applications that can be used to empower reflection and action taking. And again, the first example we already mentioned is this example of Snap, where you can basically, let me go back a little bit in the video. which is basically help teachers and sometimes learners to quickly convert a discussion thread into a sociogram so that they can reflect in a moment to see who is connected to whom, and that type of information become very easy to access. And this is one of the pioneering tools in our community. And for myself, I developed such tool myself as well. I try to put in the hands of students so that they could reflect and tweak their participation patterns. So instead of giving this to teacher, we try to give this to students and see what they can do with it. So this is actually not a high-tech project to work on. And in the same time, a shout out to another tool. If you're using social media, for example, tools like analytic provide pretty powerful support for both network analysis and text analysis based on networks for you to, for example, quickly aggregate Twitter conversation or Facebook conversation and produce network analytics for you to reflect on, or to give other people to think about. So this is also pretty powerful, and it's happening in our community. And again, going back to what Sasha made, the point made about networks, not only social networks. This is an example from my colleagues who are working on, they're calling this as a socio-lexical networks, where they try to map discussions, map discussion that's happening in the class, try to build connections between terms instead of building connection between students, building connection between key terms, keywords in the discussion. And then from that, try to see who are connected to whom through their shared words or shared vocabulary. So when you put this in the grade 1, this is a grade 1 class, when we're talking about the water cycle, you can see in this case, a student number 17 on the left. You can click on the student and see which key term the students was contributing to their discussion, and also to see how the students were trying to contribute to the community by connecting different terms, because the terms are connected based on how they appear in their discussion. If a student are introducing multiple terms in one discussion contribution, the students helping this community, connecting different dots, different concepts in their discussion, which is a big deal for grade 1, which that's why we think it's important. So these tools like this, like KBDex, like Netlytics, are more and more, I think, available. And then it's also quite important for us to think about how we can make this even broadly available, and making them in a way, or designing them in a way that's in line with our theoretical understanding and pedagogical approaches towards learning. And I want to conclude this part by mentioning a word of caution. A word of caution that's also discussed in other learning analytics settings as well. That is, we need to be aware of implicit biases and values embedded in those analytics. In the network analysis pipeline, many analytical choices and decisions are made by sometimes different people. So for example, what you see on the left is a very popular layout called force direct layout that pushes less connected nodes to the edge while keeping the well-connected one in the center. So we need to recognize at this point that when such a visualization could boost Alice's self-efficacy or sense of belonging, because Alice is so well-connected and so central in this network, it might hurt Suni's self-image, and might hurt his future possibility of participating. So we need, really, this is a one statement to basically call for caution and call for principled design that we can use in the future to design interventions based on all kinds of tools we have based on network analysis. So that's my part about how to think about teaching and how to think about network analytics when we teach. And I will pass that to Sasha to wrap up.
Thank you, Bodong. So as we're wrapping up our webinar, we want to have some key takeaways for you guys. So first one is that networks in digital learner traces, because of the complexity of the data that often is used, requires thinking about network analysis both as a methodology. And the metrics that are being produced by the tools that can be used for reflection and monitoring need to keep in mind the generalizability, interpretability of the metrics if these measures are used for assessment. If these measures are used for reflection, then there's something that's not on the slide, but you can think of the timing of when the tool is used and what that can do or how that affects the learners. We also want to conclude with saying that network models are multi-layered, and that evaluation of networked activity is multi-layered. And so the aspects you're looking at can only be captured one dimension of what's happening when learners interact. And that distributed tools, so having tools that address these different kinds of activities that comprise social learning, can help and support the network view, both for the instructor, but also for learners to basically develop their competence in navigating the networks, because it's not always easy either. So I think if Bodong has nothing else to add to the takeaways, then we're going to thank you for your attention and hope for some exciting Q&A.
All right, thank you very much for that very interesting talk. So I'll go ahead and applaud here, and we'll get into the question and answer section. So we're going to open the floor for discussion. We have about 5 minutes to answer questions. So if you have questions, please put them in the Q&A window. It looks like one has already popped up. You're also welcome to raise your hand, and I believe Vita will need to unmute you so that you can ask your question. Okay, so the first question coming from the Q&A window, a whole bunch just popped up. So this says, could you describe how Frog interacts with Zoom a little more? Thank you, from Jason.
Thanks, Jason, for the question. Technologically, they're not connected. It's connected basically by the instructor. That was myself. So the Zoom meeting, in my teaching, I've been teaching online for a few years. I really rely on small group, the breakout rooms in Zoom for different groups to unpack their reading and dense concepts. So when I do that, I usually find it frustrating that I need to ask them to go back to their notes, go back to their annotation that they made before the class. What Frogs was useful, why it's useful is I can actually orchestrate that type of information flow using Frog. So imagine I have 3 breakout rooms, and on Frog I have three groups formed as well that are aligned with those breakout rooms, and I can send different types of information to every breakout room or breakout groups, so that when they're talking, they have that interface in front of them that present them their annotations, or present them with a kind of wiki or Google Doc type of article or document for them to edit. So that just make the collaboration more intuitive and more supported. So the technologically, they're not connected, but pedagogically, they're so central to my teaching. And that's why I think for us to think about what other tools are affording that is very interesting. And I love to learn more from everybody who can share their tricks and tips as well.
Excellent. Our next question comes from Ziad. Sorry if this is a silly question, but how can ordinary everyday teachers without a data science specialty benefit from your research?
So I will start, and then Sasha, I think, will talk about something. This is a very important question. So first of all, one aspect of this is there are tools like Snap or some other equivalent tools that are out there that can support, just plug and play to help you get a graph that you can play with. And so this is one thing. And secondly, if you want specialized tools that some of them we demonstrated, or Sasha, presented those very detailed analysis, it does need a team, to rally and to solve the specific question you want to answer. So Sasha, do you want to add more?
I think that the best way instructor can start thinking about how to use some of these tools is to start designing teaching activity as a networked activity. And that is not a simple task either on its own. As Bodong has shown, there's a range of tools you can use. So once you start imagining teaching space as the space where learners are navigating and distributing networks of interactions where they navigate this information, then you will start thinking of what it is that you want to know about what they're doing, and that when the research can come in. What I was trying to illustrate with going through the analysis is the range is really vast, and it may look like it's all the same, but it isn't. And so the only way the instructor can see the value in what's out there is by having a very clear idea what you're actually doing in what kind of network, how are you applying the network lens in your practice? So then you can find relevant pieces. There is no one thing that can work for everybody, and the insights can also mean different things. So my message would be, look at some of the way technologies can be combined to designing a network learning activity, and then the rest will eventually come into place.
Okay, so we have about 1 minute left, so I'm going to turn it back over to Anushka for final comments. Anushka, you are muted right now.
I see, thanks. Yeah, since we're running out of time, I guess it's best to close this session. Well, first, a very big thank you to our presenters today. I really like the format of having two people, and you were really a smooth team in the presenting, so thanks. And also thank you to the audience for joining us today. And if you'd like to see more about this, we will post the video of the webinar, and feel free to contact our presenters. Their contact information is on screen right now. And yeah, we will have our next webinar in June and announce more details about that in our newsletter. So feel free to sign up for the Solar newsletter, and yeah, tell a colleague about us. Vita, you have some closing comments?
Yes, I just posted a link to in the chat. So if you can provide us the Google Forms for event feedback, so we would like to hear from you what you think, and any ideas for the future presentations and how we can improve them. So, yeah.
All right. With that, we thank everyone, and stay healthy, and hope to see you soon.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.